Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. And I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to have this conversation with Farid Panjwani. We often find when we get together, our conversations are lengthy and impactful. So we've got very strict instructions to stay to time today. And we really look forward to hearing your questions, your comments. So please feel free to add your comments in the chat and your questions, and the team will ensure that we get to them and answer them. Farid, let's just take a moment and think about where we are with education at this point in time. We know that education has expanded exponentially over the last 2 centuries, and we have quite specific metrics now that we can use to identify the impact of education, global growth in global literacy rates, and increasing rates of enrollment in primary education. But we also know that we have systemic inequalities in access to education, and this was the case even before the pandemic. If we then think about the pandemic and the first lockdown last year in 2020, those of us who are parents can really attest to this, and even globally, there was huge disruption to schooling and education. The UN estimates now that just under 24 million additional children from pre-primary to tertiary may not re-enter education due to the economic impact of the pandemic. So we are in a crisis when it comes to education in terms of access. But then there are further layers of complexity. And what we really need to think about when we talk about education is also the quality of education. And Farid, I know this is a really, really strong area of emotion for you, education for what purpose? It's very close to your heart. So we recognize the value of education as a fundamental human right, and it's a primary driver of progress across all 17 Sustainable Development Goals set out by the United Nations. It's necessary to create fair, equal, and peaceful societies. However, we can see when education is not delivered in line with the needs of society, this has ramifications. And so, Farid, my starting point is the title of our session today. Is education always a force for good?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Shaheena and the organizers for this opportunity to have this conversation. I'm really, and also thank you very much for all the audience members who have joined us. So I'll start with a preamble in order to respond to your question in the title. You see, if we think about the way we use the term education today predominantly, I think it is strongly connected with institutions and qualifications. So for example, in our CVs, usually we have a section called educational, and under that we put our qualification and institutions. We ask each other, where were you educated? What is your educational level? We ask, what is the state of education in a particular country? And there we mean, and we get enrollment data, pass rate, other kinds of things, prestigious institutions. So that's one thing. Now, I'll park it and make another point, and then I'll connect the two. So a few days ago, I got a research proposal from a university which wanted to work with us. And the first line of that research proposal was that Pakistan's biggest problem is illiteracy. Now, most people would just agree. I also usually tend to agree. But on this occasion, I stopped and asked, really, is it the biggest problem? What problem illiteracy has caused in Pakistan? And I couldn't think of many. And then I thought, what are the real problems in Pakistan? I thought, well, corruption is a big problem. Bad governance is a big problem. Indifference of ruling elite is a big problem. And all of these people who have created these problems are educated in the sense in which I mentioned education as institutions and qualifications. If you will ask them, where were you educated? They can give you the names of the places and all. And then I thought, maybe Pakistan is some kind of idiosyncrasy, so we should think worldwide. And I thought of the world, and I thought, well, there also, think of these Pandora papers that we have just been revealed to us. I mean, who are these people who helped create this? Very well-educated lawyers, financial wizards, accountants. Think of weapons of mass destruction. Who creates them? Think of the technologies that have destroyed the environment so much. So I thought, well, I mean, there seems to be something not right here, that on the one hand, as you very rightly said, we are probably the most educated generation in human history. Um, about, on average, 40% of human beings today have gone through tertiary education. It was only 9% in 1970, so such a huge increase. And yet we don't see correspondence increase in the kind of outcomes we would expect from education. So my point in this title was not really to say education is not for force for good, but to say that, look, there seems to be some dissonance between these two facts. And therefore, we probably need to think seriously about what goes on in the name of education. And maybe we have taken it for granted that just because we go to institutions and have a qualification, that really makes us educated and we expect good things. And I think it was this reflective moment that I wanted to capture in this title.
Thank you so much, Farid. And as you're talking about that, I think that really critical point about the maturity around education, it's not just about what we access now, but why we're accessing education, for what purpose, and where we choose to align ourselves with institutions becomes really important. And you as you start to hint about these issues, let's just think a little bit more about COVID. We know that COVID's had a huge impact, particularly in terms of access, but then also, I think as well, how we see education. Again, this question, for what purpose? And yesterday we celebrated World Teachers' Day. And the theme this year is very much about teachers being at the heart of education recovery in light of the crisis caused by the pandemic. So when we think about the impact of COVID, how do we think about the role in our perceptions of teachers, and what do you think has changed as a result of the pandemic?
So yes, no, thank you very much for bringing in COVID, because it has been a moment of reflection and pause for many people on many grounds. And I think for education also. So one option that we have is simply to say, well, it was a disruption and let's go back to how it was. But I think it's also an opportunity for us to ask first order questions about education. I mean, for example, it has become all clear that perhaps schools are not as central to education as we thought. I mean, you see, I mean, that's one. But perhaps it has also become clear that teachers are more central than we thought they were. But if I just continue with the point and link it with this COVID issue that you've raised, you see, this gives us a chance to ask questions, big questions about education. For example, what are the roots of our present education system? And if you think about the roots, the present mass education system started under two major influences: colonization and industrial revolution. And as a result, we find that the things that are really valued in this education system includes knowledge, skill development, discipline, and efficiency. These are the things that really are. And if you're good in these, you will excel in this education. And I think that made sense at a certain point in time, but I wonder whether it is enough now. These are all necessary things. Because you see, it is possible to understand and still not care. I mean, think of the colonial encounters. The people were sent as colonial officers. They learned the languages of the indigenous people. They learned their cultures and used it to govern them more efficiently, rather than really respect and nurture and work with them in equal terms. Similarly, one may know a lot about trees and forests and end up making harvesters to destroy the forests. So I feel that the missing element really is the notion of care towards ourselves and towards the world and towards others. Because that is at the heart of the common good. We create common good because we care about others as well as we care about ourselves. And I think this is the element that I feel we need to inject. And teachers are at the heart of it. And I think many people are realizing, because they tried to educate their children and they saw how challenging it is. And I think And the teachers are central because teachers as human beings can create and give the students this sense of care, which is necessary. The schools could be a place of learning. And if that is the case, then we care about exam results. But if we think of schools as places where human beings are developed, where personalities are formed, then teachers become more significant. And I think COVID has shown us once again that teachers and the quality of teacher really matters in the quality of education that we can give.
Thank you. And actually, as you were talking, a couple of comments really struck me. We spent a lot of time last year during COVID talking about frontline staff and particularly healthcare workers. When we also think about teaching, at least in the UK, and I think this was the case across the world, most teachers were not furloughed. I mean, we had the furlough scheme in the UK. Teachers were not furloughed because they were as critical to ensure that children still were supported. Even if it was homeschooling, the amount of support and infrastructure going behind the scenes was absolutely critical. So I think just even for children and parents to really understand the centrality of the role of teaching has become, really important. And so with a certain wry smile, I'm seeing T-shirts in shops now saying, I missed maths, I missed my teachers, I missed schools, which kids are buying and wearing as they start the new academic year. Your point about industrialization and colonialism, it's so critical again to us understanding why we are where we are with education. And again, the one thing that struck me, one of my most famous writers and thinkers in this field is Sir Ken Robinson, who sadly passed away last year. But I remember very early on in my academic career watching his TED talk about schools kill creativity.
Yes.
And just understanding the machinery behind schooling in terms of mass production of education. And it was a very necessary thing to increase access and streamline a system. But now we're at a point where actually we need so much more individuality and a different way of nurturing education. So your point about care can't be automated and it can't be on this sort of factory line. It's got to be much more holistic and really understanding the needs of children and students and the needs of what's important right now to ensure that students recognize what they're being taught is relevant and isn't just an application of facts, but actually the problem solving and creativity, which is so important now more than ever.
Absolutely. In fact, long ago, before Ken Robinson, Ivan Illich wrote a book called De-Schooling Society. And I think this is an important point, that to be able to distinguish the point about schooling and education, they're not the same thing. We often just take them as synonyms. They're not. And I think education is more holistic, bigger, more caring, critical. So that is, I think, what we should be focusing on. But often it happens not just in this case, but in many other cases, when something gets institutionalized, the institutions take a life of their own. And I think it takes an effort, a continuous effort, to ensure the essence for which the institution was created is not lost in the institutionalization process. And I think this is where I feel COVID has given us a chance, whether we take it or not, to really make this distinction and focus on education rather than schooling.
And it's great to see questions are coming through, and a question that follows on from this point, Farid, which I will share with you. How has the role of parents changed and become more integrated in education since COVID? And is this helpful or detrimental to the classroom?
Well, it is very good, I think, because you see, the good education is a kind of triangle between the student, the teacher, and the family. When they work together, we see very good results. So I think parents' greater engagement and critical engagement to ask questions is a very, very good thing, and to be involved in the education of their children. Because you see, and again, this is a distinction between education and schooling. If we think of education restricted to schooling, then parents give up their role. But if we think of education as an ongoing process, then the home always remains a major source of education. So the conversations we have over the dinner table, the engagements we have, the books we read, the questions we ask, the creativity that we allow, the space for mistakes that we allow at home is as much an education as at school. So I think it is a good development. And again, it is very important that we capture it and not miss it and go back to the old normal, where often, I think the best schools always knew this and they have done it. but many schools don't. So I think there's an opportunity for a more engaging relationship between school and family and communities at large, which can only be good for the child.
Great. Now, if we focus on Pakistan more closely, access to quality education is a challenge. And it does differ from province to province and city to city. And we see huge urban and rural divides. Can you explain why this is the case? And also perhaps moving into then how this can be tackled, and in particular the role of AKUIED in this process?
Yes, it is true that like many other places, the enrollment data, the quality data varies from province to province. Even now we know the district level data as well there also. So in one province, for example, you may have fifth grade students being able to read sentences. Their numbers might be as high as 60%, while in other cases it's as low as 10% as well. So there's a huge disparity. I mean, there are socioeconomic, there are political reasons for that, and how the resources are distributed, that's an issue. So one of the things that has happened in Pakistan in the last 10 or 12 years is the devolution of education. It's now a provincial rather than a federal matter. Um, but it's also a debate whether it is working or not. I think the fundamental issue is the lack of political will. Improving the standards of education is not something that cannot be done. You have even in the neighborhood countries which have done very well. Sri Lanka is an example, parts of India are an example. So I think it can be done. The political will in the ruling elite is really the most important thing. One simple example. Um, we discussed that teachers are at the heart of it. So then we must care who becomes the teacher and how the teachers are prepared. Well, that means you need to have some kind of qualifications to enter into teaching profession. We care who becomes a doctor because immediate effect is on our bodies. So we make sure that nobody comes close to the patient without having proper qualifications of MBBS or something else. Similarly for nursing. But we don't have that kind of minimum qualification for teachers. And if they are there, often they are disregarded in recruitment. We don't have teaching license. So one of the things that IED is now working very intensely. So I think we need to, again, this is a matter of caring for the future of the children to ensure that they are taught by the best qualified teachers. And it's the absence of political will, which I think is at the heart. It's not really resources. And it's really not the availability of people who are willing to be part of the education process. And it's also not the absence of any good examples around us from where we can draw. It's really the political will, absence of political will, which is at the heart of it. And some governments are better at it and others are less. This government, present government, at least in its articulation, seems to be very committed. And I saw a question about single national curriculum. That's one of the things they are doing. Later on, we can perhaps talk about that as well.
And actually, Farid, there's a question I do want to pick up on the back of this comment. The government is bringing terminal board examinations at primary level and at middle school level. Will this increase critical thinking and creativity in the students, or will it be detrimental to these two elements of skills development?
Well, you see, now this is an empirical question, so it really depends on how things work out. I think my personal belief is that we should not have exams until very late, as late as possible, and they should only be for particular purposes. But then many people would argue that in our system here at the moment, if you don't have exams, you don't have accountability, and you cannot, you need those two. But I do hope that even if they bring the exams at primary and at the class 8 level, it is not at the individual level, but they only do it at the school level comparisons rather than at the individual level. Because you see, no matter how good the exam is, at the end of the day, if exam becomes focused, then learning becomes for exams and not for human development, not for the development of the mind, because at the end it becomes utilitarian. So I think the less, the better. But when it should happen, it should be good, it should be high quality. And that's where AKU's own exam board excels, because it has really changed the paradigm of examination. Um, but it is something like salt. It should be in little amounts rather than too much, I think.
Well, and actually, as with salt as well, too much of it causes huge problems. And we know the correlation between the stress in school education and then the rise in mental health issues as well. So, I think you're absolutely spot on with that. And there are some more questions coming through around exam boards, but we'll pick those up later. So thank you for sending questions in. Please keep sending the questions in. But Farid, I'd like to just ask you again, coming back to a question around access to education in Pakistan and the fact that there are such a large number of children who are out of school. What do you think are the causes for this trend?
Yes, I think this is a big issue here. Pakistan has, according to estimates before COVID, 22.5 million children, school-going age children out of school, which made it number 2 in the world in terms of size. I don't know, the numbers now must be higher. So conservatively, we can say 25 million or more. That's almost 50% of this. And just think of it, these children not getting even functional literacy. What are the reasons? I think, again, part of it is simply state failing to reach to these kids. Poverty is another reason, because parents often feel that, look, it's better that they are working something, bringing some money rather than. Then there are also issues related specifically to gender. Sometimes girls are not able to go to school because of the distance, or because not having the right kind of facilities of hygiene and other things in school, and the parents are then reluctant to send. So there are multiple factors that are there. But that's just one issue. Then we have a large number of students also who go to schools with a very poor quality, where I think not going to school might have been better, because they would have been their natural curiosity, natural desire to ask questions and explore would not have been compromised by poor schooling. So I think these are major issues. Fortunately, again, attention is being paid there, and it is becoming more and more an important area of work. IED has done 3 big projects there, one in Gilgit, one Chitral, one in Sindh, and we aim to continue to work on in this area, because I mean, you can create even single national curriculum, but if the children are simply not in schools, I mean, this is not a national curriculum then. So I think it is a very important area, and multiple reasons are there, and therefore the solutions are also complicated. In some cases, you can simply bring existing children to existing schools. Other cases, you have to create new schools. In other cases, you have to create accelerated curricula, different kinds of curricula to help these children, because they may have passed school going age as well. So you have to do something different pedagogically with them to ensure that they reach. And I think IED is working on it, many other organizations. We perhaps need to come together to really take this as a national crisis and work on this.
And again, I'm really struck as you're talking about that, creating solutions. It's so much about the care at the heart of what's being done, and very much creating a design-centered approach to really understanding what the barriers are, the challenges are, and not just an automatic rollout of new schools, more whatever, but really understanding what the pain points are and how that can be supported. And you've talked about some of the solutions and how IED is tackling these areas. What else is IED looking at to tackle some of the big challenges around education in Pakistan? I know you've got some very exciting areas that you're working on, so it'd be lovely to hear some of the big ones.
Thank you. This is helpful. So, I mean, there are lots of areas, but our focus is basically teaching quality of teachers. So everything moves around it, but that is at the heart of it. A major area there is ECD, early childhood, because I think we are something that as wisdom tradition, intuitively human beings knew the importance of childhood. But now more modern scientific research is also corresponding with that. We are realizing, it is very interesting that the age in which we are formed the most, where our character, our abilities get framed in the most powerful ways, because the neurons again, these things become hardwired at that time. This is the age where we have least control over ourselves. We are really dependent on others. So I think that is again going back to the aspect of the care, that we need to have that culture at home, in schools, that really cares for that little child. And this is where I also feel that the issue of child abuse is just something that is so painful, because it at the heart of is not caring for this vulnerable child. So ECD and child safeguarding is one of the major areas that we are working on. Today's world, a good understanding of science ought to be universal. So education, better education of scientific ways of understanding is similarly maths is this almost every aspect of our life. So maths education is also very important. We also have programs in English language, um, development of English language. Of course, all of this is brought together by educational leadership. Um, and it ensures that the resources and the processes are there to ensure that we have a good quality education. So educational leadership is another area that we have, and I already mentioned out of school children. And increasingly, three areas are becoming prominent, which I would like to mention. One is digital pedagogy. And that is, although we had programs in online learning for a long time, but it has taken a new force in recent years. Now here, I also want to mention that it's not just about accessing through technology, accessing knowledge, but what online learning has done is really opened a new horizon for accessing knowledge. There's an ocean that is now available. And this ocean consists of all kinds of things. We did a small survey in Chitral, and we found that teachers are often doing very good job and finding great resources. But sometimes they are not able to distinguish between the wonderful presentations that are done by right-wing extremisms or climate deniers, and they create very sleek videos, which are then shown to the students because the teachers have struggled. So critical media literacy or critical digital literacy becomes very important. And that's going forward will be a very important thing. Environmental education, climate change. Pakistan is among the most threatened countries in terms of climate change. And I think we owe to the next generation that they should have a better understanding of climate change from the beginning. So we are moving into that. And the whole area of inclusive education, whether it is gender, special needs, or other aspects. So these are some of the avenues in which, through teaching, research, and actually working with schools and projects, that the ID is trying to make a difference.
And I'm actually struck by the way you started talking about ECD and your final point about inclusive education, because research shows that by the age of 5, socialized behavior, learned behavior will enforce gendered norms. So even by the age of 5, girls will opt out of science, the subjects you've just talked about being so important, science, maths, even thinking, role-playing about whether they want to role-play to be a doctor, a nurse, hairdresser, teacher, scientist, astronaut. So we know that it's absolutely critical to think about the inclusive education piece, think about social change and responsibilities of students, and then bringing that all the way back into ECD, which it's absolutely it makes so much sense when you really piece these pieces together. And once again, I keep reinforcing this point because I think it's so powerful, and it has come up on the chat as well, the notion of teachers caring, really caring for that being that sits in their classroom, and then what that means in wider society. Okay, thank you. There's lots of questions coming through, but I still want to ask you a few more questions before we jump to the chat. What are your aspirations for IED? You've talked about these big areas you're looking at and working on, and they are big, meaty areas. As you're still settling into this role, if you were to look forward, I'm not going to give you a time frame, I'm going to let you decide that, but what are your aspirations for IED?
So I joined the office in person in January. And since then, I have gone to different parts of the country, met many people. And hand on my heart, I can say that um, my predecessors, teachers, students, teens have really created a place that is loved by people in education. They respect it very much, and its impact is huge. And so, the first of all, I would very much like to build on that heritage that I have received of goodwill, of impact, of positivity that is there towards the IED. I think what has enabled this is the focus on innovation, meaningful innovation, trying, testing few things, and then letting it being adopted by others. So one can cite many examples of pedagogies, many examples of institutionalizations that IED has done, which have now become part and parcel of educational discourse and of other institutions. Our students have gone, so we have, just to give one example, professional development centers, 3 professional development centers. They work closely with schools and with teachers, and teacher development is at our graduates have gone on to establish their own professional development. They even use the same. One place calls itself a Mountainous Institute for Educational Development. Many schools have PDCs. So this is the impact. And I would hope that this continues. This focus on innovations and focus on testing new ideas and then throwing it. Because IED is not going to have a huge numerical influence on the country. Ultimately, the state will have to take up its responsibility. In any part of the world where you see good education, it's because the state has played a very positive role. NGOs, private sectors have a role, but they cannot change the whole system. They can advocate, they can create good models, and I think that's what the IED should do. So in that context, I would very much like to continue the good work and the strengths we have and add new things like environmental education, special needs, and digital pedagogy. But above all, I would like to continue this spirit of innovation that we have. And I'm glad that this is shared by the faculty, by staff, by student as well. So we are all together in ensuring that the spirit of innovation continues as we go forward.
And I'm very much struck as you say that, because you talk the point you made about meaningful innovations. We've seen in education where educators, policymakers a lot have experimented with new ways of thinking, and not always to the benefit of students or to teachers. It's sometimes been to the detriment. So this idea about meaningful innovation is really powerful. And as you were talking, it really struck me that IED has the potential, and is perhaps already doing this, I'm sure, to be an incubator in developing new methods, new approaches. Because as you said, once that new thinking comes out, it just bubbles through society and has that ripple effect. And that thinking is proven, it's tested. You've gone through that proof of concept and saying, this is what works. We've done the heavy lifting. Now let's start spreading this across the country and different regions to support teachers and students and parents in that education.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I maybe could here mention that one of the things that we are working on is teaching licensing, because I think that's very crucial. We have done our research internationally and have seen a strong correlation between countries that have a good way of preparing teachers, either through qualification or licensing, and the outcomes that they show. And I think it would be very good for us to have that. And now, as a private institution, we cannot do teaching license, a state that does, but we are trying to advocate and create the research that is needed to make it happen. And we hope that this will happen in not so far future.
I'm going to just take some of the questions, because some that are coming up now are so relevant to this conversation, and rather than zipping back and forth, it would be useful to pick those up. So there's a question here: how does IED work with the state? As a private institution, can it influence the state? And how does IED do this in Pakistan?
Okay, so so 3 things I would like to say. One, we work with the state through capacity building. That's first. We have done many projects where government of Balochistan or Punjab or Sindh or GB have sent their leaders, their teachers to us and we work very closely with them. So capacity building in terms of staff and educational leaders is one. Second, we are almost always consulted and asked to comment and give input in the policy making. In fact, there are many policy documents that very explicitly mention the IED as well. So we give. We don't have much control over implementing those policies, but at least on paper we are able to do. And third, we also have, because our MEd graduates, many of them come from the government public sector, and they've gone, about 1/3 are actually from public sector, so they go back. And I must also mention more recent work that we are doing. Pakistan is experimenting with what it calls the single national curriculum. So the idea is, at least what they say, is that all the school systems will have single curriculum. So they needed a technical advisor for that, and we were selected for that. So we give input into the curriculum, into teacher development and assessment. Again, our role is more technical advice. We don't have control over whether they take that advice or not, but we were chosen for that. So that's also where we are working closely with the government.
And following on from that point, there was a question earlier about the implementation of a single national curriculum, and the question whether or not it's really an academic decision.
Which academic decision is only an academic decision? So I think it is a mix of academic and political decision. This is shown by the time frame as well, because the government wants to complete it in its own tenure, which shows that, yeah. But there's one thing, I mean, I won't go into the debates about single national curriculum here, but one thing I would say, an opportunity has been created because education has never been so much in discussion as it is now because of single national curriculum. Every day you have articles, every day you have seminars. So the civil society is talking about education. And this has never happened in the 70 years of history. One or two things here and there, and that's it. For last almost 1.5 years, a sustained discussion on the education in Pakistan is happening. And I think that's a very good thing in itself, because if that continues, then the civil society can force the government to take the right kind of step. It's criticism, it's suggestions, it's comments. So the latest that I have heard is that the National Curriculum Council, which is what is creating single national curriculum, has agreed, to the best of my knowledge, that going forward, all the feedback that it will receive on its curriculum draft will be put on a portal where it will be available for public, and they will justify what they are taking and what they are not taking and why. I think that's a very good thing, because it means that the suggestions from education community, suggestions from civil society, is not just going into a black hole where we don't know where it is and it never comes out, but it will be public and transparency will be there. So this is the hope that I have, that it has made education very central to the consciousness and imagination of people. And if we can take advantage of that, I think there is a possibility of a positive outcome of that.
And again, I think, as we said earlier, when you combine that timing with also being in this COVID recovery stage and having experienced last year such a huge amount of disruption to education, those conversations you're talking about at civil society level do start to permeate into households as well. And it comes back to your point about that triangle between schools, yes, parents, and children. So that more active engagement rather than passively talking about the educational experience. So it almost is a perfect storm to really address some of the key issues around education right now. I'm going to pick up a few more questions before I come back to you with my questions. Today we have a large number of educated people with great amounts of knowledge, but little wisdom or moral or ethical bearings. And again, this comes back to the point you made at the beginning. about education for what purpose, and looking at how educated people still make decisions and have an impact on our daily lives, and huge impacts actually around the world. So the question here is, how important is it, and how can we change our education system to put greater weight on acquiring wisdom and moral grounding? Now that's a big question.
Yes, and wisdom, I don't know, but I think one of the things we can do, there are many things, but one just I'll mention, because I can then bring in another part of the EQ there is perhaps greater emphasis on the humanities, the arts and the humanities. Even IED has not done that so far, but I hope that going forward we will put more emphasis, and the humanities will be at par with our other aspects. But we are beginning to do that, and the university as well is, as you know, will have a faculty of arts and sciences. I think the provision, and the more we think about the humanities, better teaching of history, literature, philosophy, these can help. Let me give you one remark here. There is a book called Engineers of Jihad, which is written by a professor from Oxford and one from LSE. And through statistical analysis, they have concluded something very interesting, which I think many people already knew, but they have shown it numerically. The disproportionate number of people from technical backgrounds are attracted to what we call extremism in the Muslim context. So you would find many people with those technical backgrounds. And interestingly, and this is the point I want to make, hardly anybody from the humanities background is among the big names in that context. And I think that is because the humanities help you grapple with gray areas of life. It helps you be more tolerant of the varieties of interpretations that are there. And you can suspend your judgment before you really have more information. So I think strengthening the arts and the humanities, both for the personal enhancement of the person and for the societal enhancement, are very important. And I think if Pakistan can pay more attention to the education in the arts and the humanities, it is going to be very beneficial for its collectively and individually.
I would echo that, and actually say not just Pakistan, even globally. I think there's been such a big shift around the STEM subjects, the science, technology. It's no surprise now that actually STEM has become STEAM, and arts has been inserted into engineering and maths, because to have that creativity, that innovation, everything you've been talking about, the care, it has to come from a more liberal perspective, not just having the science and the technology, but actually really having a wider perspective. And again, from a leadership perspective, if you think about organizations, we keep talking about cognitive diversity underpinning innovation, and that leads to better performance, better outcomes. And we try to create teams that are cognitively diverse. But if we encourage that cognitive diversity amongst individuals, there is a much more holistic way and a rounded way of actually approaching problem solving in the first place. So it's certainly something that's a big requirement globally, but a great place to start in Pakistan as well.
If I may just make one point, Shane, I mean, we started with the global, and we discussed Pandora and other things. So many of the issues that we are talking about really are global, or to apply to many. We are focusing on Pakistan simply because ID is based on Pakistan and conversation is around that. But you are absolutely right that these are the discussions that need to happen in many parts of, because the colonial and industrial revolutionary heritage of education is almost across the world. And therefore, many of the issues that we discussed that focus on discipline and efficiency and skills and knowledge is across the world. And the problems are also therefore quite universal that we need to tackle.
Great. Okay, let's have a look at another question. So question, this is about teachers and training teachers. How can teachers be trained to, and there are two elements to this, how can teachers be trained to be more approachable in the way they teach, and also to be more mindful to help improving confidence and self-concept? So I think it's self-confidence and feedback to students.
Yes. So now the first thing I would say is that we need to drop the word train and training. See, so we never use the word teacher training, because teaching is not something that you get trained into. Uh, Training, you learn a skill that you then apply. You can be skillful and trained to how to type, for example. But teaching is such a complex matter. It requires your heart and mind at the same time. You have to make immediate decisions, observations, judgments. You need to know so many things, from pedagogical content knowledge to psychology to others. So we talk about teacher development, teacher education. And I think this is very, very important, and it needs to be given due course. It needs to given a status, so that people of good mind and energy are attracted to it, and it is not a choice of the last resort, which often happens. And I think that is very important, the status of, and we are conducting a major research on the status of teaching as well. And alongside that, to have mechanisms like proper qualifications and teaching license to ensure that people have the standards that are required to go to the classroom. And then proper ways of retaining teachers, the career paths, to ensure that they get the remuneration that is due for them. You can see around the world, the best systems really treat teachers at the same level as any other profession. So I think the professionalization of teachers is at the heart of it. From who you attract to who you retain, the whole thing has to be looked at. And that is the way. It's going to take time, but there is no shortcut to this. And that is the way I think the entire education system can be uplifted.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to shift gear a little bit with the next question. And this is about vocational skill-based education. So the question is, can we have vocational or skills-based education for children who are out of school, which commensurate with the belief system of their parents and their sources of earning?
Very good, very good, very good question. And that is why you see, it is interesting that we call these children and their identity becomes out of school children, which automatically makes the school the standard. So you see, they are out of school. That's what I think we need to change that, because the research we have done, we have Professor Dilshad Ashraf, we have Professor Mauladad and others who have worked on, they have realized and they have shown in their work that these children have their own literacies. They have capacities, they know occupations, they know maths, because they are, of course, working apprentice in other ways. So we need to begin where they are and not force them into a particular model. And that is where we need educational models, curriculum models that start with where they are and then take them to different places. So you're absolutely right. Parental issues, the context, and the children's own current literacies have to be the basis of engaging with what we, I think, incorrectly call out of school children, because that really reduces their identity to going to school or not. And of course, they have much more to offer than simply having numbers and literacies.
And actually, following on from that, there's a question that has just come up about COVID and the fact that this break, this disruption to education allowed us to reflect on the education system and whether we were coming at this from parents or as teachers, really thinking about the education system, but also giving students a chance to really step back and think about relating their relationship with the environment, which the questioner has said is missing in our education system. However, the standardized education system compels teachers to move back to the traditional ways of teaching and to ensure that specific subjects are covered in the syllabus. How would you suggest teachers and parents induce and encourage creativity among students?
Okay, so the word I want to introduce here is imagination. And I think, I mean, I sometimes ask, can you imagine life without imagination? Which is a very well, it's a small way to bring out the centrality of imagination to our lives. Whether we are trying to plan something, or we are even looking at the moon, imagination is at play. Um, and we often think of it in terms of the arts only, but actually imagination is at the heart of science as well. We can only think about the past in our imagination because it doesn't exist in front of us empirically. And I think if we nurture imagination, that is going to help in creativity. Now, the interesting thing is, nature grants children a wonderful imagination. And there's nobody can beat children when it comes to imagination. They can make anything into a horse, for example. Um, and as you going back to Ken Robinson, as you had highlighted, often our systems destroy because we force them all into a similar kind of ways. So I think we need a system from the early childhood. That's where it is important, because sometimes children have lost these things even before coming to school. So it has to start from family. And there are many now pedagogical things that we can do. So the first thing I would say is, let's not destroy the imagination that nature has, and the creativity that nature has produced in the child. Secondly, I think a very important thing that is required for creativity at any, and it is true for organization as well, is this space to make mistakes. Because if you are not, if you fear mistakes, then you will not experiment, and you will suppress your imagination. So the space to make mistakes, to be trusted that what you are doing is out of goodwill, and even the mistakes are made, I think that's very, very important. And then, of course, there are many, I mean, literature is a very good source because it really allows imagination to flourish. History, if not simply taught as facts, but as one and seen as a construction done through interpretations, can be a very great source. Science, see, when we make some kind of observation and we want to explain it, we create a hypothesis. That's an act of imagination. So I think to see the work of imagination in all of this, and then through pedagogical exercises, ensure chess is a very good way of nurturing imagination, because you have to. So I think we need to bring back the discourse on imagination and then see how we can educate the imagination. And there are lots of buzz. And in the last 20 years, many good research and publications have happened on imagination. And I hope that as we move more in the arts and humanities, imagination will acquire more central place in the work of the ID as well.
Great, thank you. I have two final questions, which will allow us to finish on time. You've talked a lot about imagination and creativity, and we were talking about how IED is this hub of meaningful innovation to allow these different ways of educating, developing teachers, and really strengthening the education ecosystem in Pakistan is developing. And you've shared some really inspiring and big aspirations for IED. What kind of support does IED need to achieve this? And really, how can all of us who are on the webinar today with you help?
Great, thank you for this. So the task is huge, as you can see, and it's great that you asked about the challenges so that one can contextualize. So one of the big things, and that we are very proud of at the ID is, and not just the ID, it's across the AKU, is that we insist that any student who qualifies through our qualifying system and becomes eligible for studies should be able to study regardless of financial situation. So we have a needs blind admission policy, but it's very expensive. Um, we have many examples, many stories of students starting from a village with very little opportunities in terms of formal education, gradually making through different systems, coming to the IED, and there our financial support system helped that person. The person has then gone on to Oxford, to Toronto, or other places, and now playing a very important role. We have some such stories, inspiring stories in our own faculty members as well. So I think one of the areas where we really need support is to continue with this motto and this ambition that we will be able to educate every student who deserves to be educated at the IED, regardless of the financial constraints. And for that, we need support. We also need support beyond finances. and that is intellectual, because we are very small in terms of our number of faculty members, 20. But we have managed to do some good work because of the connections and partnerships. So I think people who are themselves in education or interested in education, we would be delighted to hear from them, to see how in research, in teaching, in other things. In fact, we have recently launched an initiative called Network of Professionals, which you can find on our website. And its purpose is to bring people who have different abilities, expertise in ECD, in science, in digital, in environmental education to connect with us, so that together, and institutions as well, so that we can offer and do much more than our numbers. Third, I think it would be very good in terms of supporting us to really take our message to other places. So we have a vibrant social media um, environment now and websites. Be connected to us, learn about what we are doing, give us suggestions. Your critique will help as well. That's very important. That tell us that, look, this you have done well, but this is where you are perhaps can do better. And I think because that will help us a lot. So a critical relationship with us would be, a constructive critical relationship would be very helpful, helping us in terms of knowledge and skills and partnering with us, and also supporting us where possible in financial terms to ensure that our social mission and the social value that we create continues.
So as you've put those requests out, it really hits me that there is the opportunity for anyone and everyone to partner with you, whether it's financial support, whether it is educationalists, academics, individuals involved in education in any way, helping to be part of the partnership network you have, and then others as well providing input, critical relationships. Whether the beauty is everyone has had experience of education in most cases. And so being able to share that thinking, that experience, whether it's as somebody who's benefited from it, as a parent, prospective parent, working, whatever, the opportunities are there. So critical relationships, networks of professionals, and financial support to keep that chain going. It's absolutely crucial. Okay, we're out of time. So Farid, thank you. It's been such a fantastic conversation. There's been lots on the chat.
Thank you.
Fatima, do I hand back over to you to say thank yous and goodbyes?
All you, Shaheena.
Okay, well, just really thank you to all of you for your engagement. It's been such a fantastic session today. There's been a lot in the chat, which I'm hoping we've covered everything. And Farid, thank you so much. I think you've left us all very inspired and excited, and I'm sure your social media accounts and your website with the network of professionals will certainly get a lot of hits as participants start going and checking those out right now.
Thank you, Emma. Very kind and wonderful conversation with you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.